Texas, a land known for its tough laws and unforgiving death sentences. Here, more than 170 people on death row are still alive, not free, but waiting for the end. If you haven't seen Part 1, go back and watch it now. Who are they? Why haven't they been executed yet? And is death really the only thing drawing near? Number 1. Paul Gilbert Devoe III. Texas, summer of 2007. A quiet suburban home was broken into. Police found 4 bodies: a mother, her 2 teenage daughters, and the mother's boyfriend. The scene was deeply unsettling. 200 kilometers away, a bartender was shot to death inside an empty bar. The killer was the same man, Paul Gilbert Devoe III. Devoe fled across 3 states, leaving blood at every stop. The journey played out like a real-life version of Natural-Born Killers, but without the movie lights, only real victims. He was captured after just a few days on the run. In court, Devoe didn't deny the charges, but he said, "I know I was wrong, but I want to live." The truth lay within that confession. It wasn't about guilt, it was a desperate will to survive. Even after killing several people, he still begged for one more breath, as if even he didn't understand why he had done it. He was sentenced to death. But the real haunting question is this: if the killer himself felt lost, who else could possibly explain why the blood was shed? Number 2. Anthony Cardell Haynes. Houston, 1998. On an October evening, Officer Kent Kincaid had just finished his shift and was driving his wife home. When an SUV suddenly blocked their path, he didn't even have time to show his badge before a single shot ended his life on the spot. The one who pulled the trigger, Anthony Haynes, 19 years old. He was arrested just hours later. Haynes said, "I thought he was going to shoot me first," but the prosecutor insisted. This was a street execution, carried out by someone afraid of being watched. In 1999, Haynes was sentenced to death. Nearly 14 years later, he was moved to the execution chamber. The lights were on, the needle was ready, the walls were soundproof. But exactly 2 hours before the appointed time, the United States Supreme Court ordered a stay. The reason? His defense attorney lacked experience and failed to present evidence of Haynes's mental health history. But 1 year later, in 2013, the sentence was carried out. No retrial, no further debate. Number 3. James Broadnax, Dallas, Texas. A summer night in June. 2 young college students, Stephen Swan and Matthew Butler, stood outside a church talking about music, hope, and dreams they hadn't yet put into words. That's when James Broadnax walked up, pulled out a gun, and stole everything in 8 seconds. There was no chase, no screams for help, just 2 gunshots and complete silence. One dropped instantly. The other ran a few steps, then collapsed, motionless in the empty parking lot. When arrested, Broadnax bragged to friends like he had just won a game. "I needed money, a car, and I got it." He even mocked the way the victim fell, laughing as he acted it out like a joke. But the courtroom didn't laugh. Death sentence, no objections. But the contradiction lay here. During the trial, every black juror was removed. Justice won, but it left behind the feeling of a verdict that had already been written. Number 4. Tony Egbuna Ford, El Paso, Texas. On a December night in 1991, an entire neighborhood was jolted awake by gunfire coming from the modest home of the Murillo family. When police arrived, the door was still open. Inside, Armando Murillo Jr., a young man not yet 20, was lying lifeless on the floor just outside his mother and sister's bedroom. 3 bullets. A break-in at midnight. And a family torn apart in just a matter of minutes. According to the survivor, 2 masked men broke in and opened fire without saying a word. Tony Ford was arrested days later. He was identified as the driver of the car waiting outside. He denied every accusation. No DNA, no physical evidence. He was sentenced to death in 1993. His appeals stretched over 3 decades, but never succeeded. Many believe he was just a minor link in a larger murder plot, not the one who pulled the trigger. But that changed nothing. And now, the execution date is closer than ever. Number 5. Rigoberto Avila Jr., El Paso, Texas, the year 2000. A 19-month-old boy, Brian Gutierrez, was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. His pulse was faint, no response, his eyes wide open as if he had just seen something too terrible to describe. That day, Rigoberto Avila Jr., the boyfriend of Brian's mother, was babysitting. He told doctors Brian was hurt when a 4-year-old jumped on his stomach while playing, but the doctors didn't believe it. The injuries were too severe. The internal trauma couldn't have come from a simple fall. In court, Avila's statement was dismissed as a lie. Medical experts concluded this was deliberate blunt force trauma with extreme force. But years later, as forensic science evolved, new experts suggested it might have been a tragic accident. The 4-year-old boy, now grown, still claims he caused the death, but the law does not turn back time. Avila was still sentenced to death. No direct evidence. Just one statement considered less trustworthy than the stunned gaze of a child too small to defend himself. Number 6. Fabian Hernandez, El Paso, Texas, November 3, 2006. It was an ordinary evening. Renee Urbina stood outside her parents' home holding her baby, looking toward a car parked by the gate. Inside was her ex-husband, Fabian Hernandez. He stepped out quietly, carrying nothing but a cold, silent stare. Next to Renee was Arturo Fonseca, her close friend, 24 years old, who had just gotten out of the car, not yet pulled the key from the ignition. Then, 2 gunshots rang out. Hernandez shot them both in front of the child. No warning, no hesitation. When police arrived, the baby was screaming in his grandfather's arms. His mother's body lay motionless on the grass. One sandal had been knocked out of place, and the scent of gunpowder still lingered in the air they once called home. Hernandez was arrested not long after. Once a well-known gang member, he admitted to stalking his ex-wife for days before the attack. The trial ended quickly with a death sentence in 2009. Number 7. Charles Mamou Jr., Houston, 1998. Mary Carmouche, 17 years old, left home one afternoon and never came back. Her body was later found by the roadside, showing signs of a brutal assault. Police identified a suspect, Charles Mamou Jr., a man who had once been involved in drug deals with Mary's older brother. A dispute escalated and a payback followed. In court, witness testimonies were inconsistent. No DNA, no physical evidence tying Mamou to the scene. He was sentenced to death in 2000. Mamou insisted, "I was the last person to see Mary, but I didn't kill her." The twist came years later. His defense attorney admitted they never investigated the key witness, never called a crime scene expert, and never challenged weak testimony. A noisy trial with no depth. A life left hanging on words, not on proof. Mamou remains on death row. Number 8. Gerald Eldridge, Houston, 1993. Cynthia Bogany, a 28-year-old woman, opened her apartment door after a familiar knock. Outside stood Gerald Eldridge, her ex-boyfriend and the father of her daughter. Time froze for a second before he pulled out a gun. 3 shots. Cynthia collapsed in the doorway. Her 9-year-old daughter, Charissa, witnessed everything. She ran to the bedroom and hid under the bed. Eldridge followed her. And no one else in that apartment lived to tell what happened next. He was arrested just hours later. Eldridge didn't deny his actions, but when sentenced to death, he protested, "I have a mental illness." For 30 years, his appeals revolved around one question. Was he mentally competent enough to be executed? A federal court finally ruled, yes. No one denies Eldridge killed 2 people, but here's the contradiction. Though he once heard voices and harmed himself behind bars, the legal system still declared him sane enough to die. Number 9. Edward Lee Busby Jr. Fort Worth, a winter morning in 2004. A 78-year-old woman vanished after leaving church. 3 days later, her body was found in an open field, hands and feet bound, mouth sealed with duct tape and no personal belongings left. Edward Lee Busby Jr. was arrested less than 48 hours later. Witnesses saw him withdrawing money using her card. In his car, a roll of tape identical to the one used. During questioning, Busby said, "I was just in the back seat. I don't know how she died." The court didn't believe him. He was sentenced to death in 2005. Then came a twist involving two words: intellectual disability. Busby's lawyer argued he lacked the capacity to understand the meaning of a death sentence. The court first rejected the claim, but in 2021, an unusual ruling came down. The execution was paused, just to test his mental competence. Since then, nothing has happened. Busby waits, not knowing if he'll live or die. Number 10. Guy Len Allen, Travis County, 2002. Barbara Hill, 47, and her daughter Jeanette Johnson, 19, were making dinner. A normal day, a warm, familiar kitchen. Then Barbara's ex, Guy Len Allen, suddenly appeared. No one knows what happened behind that door. What is known, minutes later, Barbara lay dead with 46 stab wounds. Jeanette, who had only tried to intervene, was stabbed 10 times. The crime scene was so disturbing that even investigators had to look away. The case shook Travis County, not just for its brutality, but because the victims were the killer's own family. Allen was arrested immediately. No resistance, no reaction. In court, his lawyer brought up a childhood of abuse, untreated trauma. The court was unmoved. Death sentence delivered. The chilling irony: justice was served. But the truth went silent forever, along with the final screams from that kitchen. Number 11. Joshua Maxwell, August 2000. Officer R. Lopes from Bazar County had just finished a late shift. He stopped by a convenience store near his home, but waiting in the dark was Joshua Maxwell, a 21-year-old, and his girlfriend, Tessie McFarland. They were on the run after taking the life of a FedEx worker in Indiana. They needed money, needed a card, and needed one more victim to make their escape. The officer was ambushed inside his car. Maxwell pulled the trigger. One shot. They took his police ID, his bank card, and left behind a motionless body. Lopes's SUV was later found a few miles from the scene. Joshua was caught shortly after, near the southern border. In court, he laughed. No remorse. But 10 years later, standing in the execution chamber, Maxwell's voice changed. That person died a long time ago. But Officer Lopes never came back. No tragic past justifies a life taken. No love is blind enough to turn two lovers into killers, and no apology can undo what was lost. Number 12. Stephen Thomas, Williamson County, Texas, 1980. The small house where Mildred McKinney lived alone stayed silent that morning, with no answer when neighbors knocked. When police broke in, they found her on the floor, strangled with her own bedsheet. No blood, no leads, a cold case. 34 years passed. In 2012, police reopened the file using new DNA technology. A fluid sample on the victim's nightgown matched Stephen Thomas. The neighborhood boy from back then, 16 years old, was now in his 50s. Thomas was arrested while living in another state. He stayed silent in court. He claimed he didn't remember anything. He had once been a teenager, but the murder had never aged. He was sentenced to death in 2014. Mildred's family attended the sentencing in tears. She waited 34 years to hear this. It wasn't the crime. It was time. Number 13. Dexter Johnson, Houston, a night in June 2006. Maria Aparice and her boyfriend sat in their car beneath a street lamp. They were talking about an upcoming date, soft music playing from the radio. Suddenly, the door flew open. Two guns pointed straight at them. A group of teens forced them to drive into a deserted lot. No money, no begging, just silence. Dexter Johnson pulled the trigger. Both victims died instantly. In minutes, 2 city college students became the subjects of a death sentence. At the time of arrest, Johnson was only 18. His lawyer said he had low IQ and brain damage. But the prosecutor insisted He knew exactly what he was doing. His record showed theft, violence, and delinquency from a young age. He remains in solitary confinement, awaiting execution. Meanwhile, Maria's parents still keep her room exactly as it was that night, where her dreams remain buried under the echoes of gunfire that never fades. Number 14. Paul David Storey, Fort Worth, 2006. Jonas Cherry, a mini-golf manager, was closing up when two young men stormed in. One pulled a gun, the other grabbed the cash. Jonas pleaded for mercy, but instead of sparing him, they shot him twice. Jonas collapsed in front of the register, a few $100 traded for a human life. Paul David Storey was the one holding the gun. He and his accomplice were quickly arrested. In court, Paul showed no remorse. He was sentenced to death in 2008. But the surprise came in the courtroom. The prosecutor claimed, "The victim's family wants the death penalty." That statement swayed the jury. But years later, Jonas's family spoke out. They had never wanted Paul to be executed. They were never asked, never invited to testify. An entire sentence built on a lie. Paul begged for clemency. A local judge supported a sentence reduction, but higher courts upheld the original verdict. Number 15. Robert Gene Will II, Houston, 2000. A police chase involving two young men ended at a cemetery near the highway. Deputy Barrett Hill, the pursuing officer, was shot and killed. There was only one witness, Michael Rosario, the man who was with Robert Gene Will. Rosario admitted to cooperating. Will, however, was accused of pulling the trigger. In court, the physical evidence was weak. No DNA, no weapon found on Will, but the courtroom was packed with uniformed officers, a blue wall pressing down on every gaze. Will was sentenced to death in 2002. Nearly 2 decades later, an emergency habeas petition was filed alleging a Brady violation, that exculpatory evidence had been deliberately withheld. A federal court allowed the case to be reopened. Will is still waiting for a retrial, and justice, though it has turned its head, has yet to speak its final word. Number 16. Emanuel Kemp Jr., Fort Worth, Texas. Early morning, May 28, 1987. A city bus sat oddly parked across the street, engine off, no driver, no passengers. But at the back of the bus was a woman's body, slumped across the last row, strangled and assaulted. Johnny May Gray, 34 years old, had been the driver on that route, a dedicated employee starting her shift before the city had fully awakened. The killer was caught that same day, Emanuel Kemp Jr., 19 years old. After a failed robbery attempt, he jumped on the bus, forced Johnny to drive him away, then ended her life when he no longer needed her. In 1988, he was sentenced to death. No appeals, no request for clemency. And since then, nearly no one has spoken Johnny May Gray's name. That bus stopped in the middle of the road. And so did every memory of the woman who drove it. And Emanuel Kemp, he's still alive, waiting for a death with no set date, a shadow in the legal system. But what's more frightening is the silence of those who have forgotten she ever existed. Number 17. Bernardo Aban Tercero, Houston, 1997. Robert Berger, a high school teacher, was shopping in a store when two men stormed in, shouting in Spanish. Within seconds, a gunshot rang out. Robert collapsed, right in front of his 3-year-old daughter. The shooters fled. 1 week later, Bernardo Tercero, a Nicaraguan immigrant, was arrested. A death sentence was handed down in 2000, based on the word of his accomplice and a rushed trial. Tercero didn't speak English. His lawyer had no certified interpreter, no witness investigations, no review of his immigration background. In 2015, just days before his scheduled execution, a Texas court halted the sentence under pressure from human rights groups and the Inter-American Commission. The tragic twist, a man who didn't understand what was happening in court was still sentenced to die. Tercero never denied being at the scene, but he's always said, "I didn't pull the trigger." Number 18. Rodolfo Alvarez Medrano, Edinburgh. 6 people shot to death, Bodies scattered, blood spilling across the tiled floor. Police quickly linked the massacre to the Tri-City Bombers gang. But Rodolfo Medrano wasn't at the scene. He didn't pull the trigger. He didn't even enter the house. His role? According to the case file, supplying the weapon. Medrano was arrested weeks later. While in custody, police brought his wife to visit. Not for comfort, but to persuade him to confess. A recording was made. That statement became evidence. The trial moved fast. No eyewitnesses, no physical proof. But, under the law of parties, Medrano was sentenced to death. The bitter irony. Someone who didn't fire a shot, wasn't present, was punished the same as a killer. The act of handing over a gun became a slow death, dragging on for nearly 20 years. Number 19. Tylen LaShawn Carter, Fort Worth, 2004. James Eldon Tomlin, an 89-year-old veteran, lived alone in a quiet little home. On that fateful morning, neighbors noticed he hadn't come outside as usual. Police were called, and they found his body lying motionless on the floor. The report said he had been strangled. The house was ransacked. Cash was missing. The killer, Tylen LaShawn Carter, 26 years old, once a home health aide who knew the old man's routines and vulnerabilities. In court, Carter claimed Tomlin had died of old age, but the autopsy revealed signs of strangulation, and a co-defendant accused Carter of being the mastermind. He was sentenced to death in 2006. But here's the twist. Nearly 11 years later, medical experts argued the original cause of death might have been wrong. It could have been natural, not violent. Carter, once labeled a cold-blooded killer, suddenly became a symbol of flawed science. But it was too late. Because once a sentence is given, justice doesn't have a rewind button. Number 20. Ramiro Ruby Ibarra, Waco, Texas, 1987. Maria de la Paz, 16, spent the night at a friend's home. When morning came, her body was found, assaulted, strangled, as if death had come in silence, unheard by anyone. No arrests, no charges. The case went cold for nearly a decade. In 1996, DNA evidence for the first time pointed to Ramiro Ibarra, an undocumented immigrant once suspected of abuse but never convicted. The trial was swift. In 1997, he was sentenced to death. Since then, Ibarra has filed countless appeals. His lawyers argued he has a very low IQ and can't understand the sentence. But there was no funding for independent experts. The court refused to reconsider. The law says no one with intellectual disability can be executed. But it gives no means for the poor to prove they qualify. Maria is gone. The case appeared solved. But justice. Can it truly stand if the most critical facts were never verified? Number 21. Kwame Abia Rockwell, Fort Worth, 2010. A liquor store robbery turned deadly. A customer couldn't escape and was shot dead on the spot. The shooter, Kwame Rockwell, 36 years old, fled but was caught in less than 24 hours. The trial dragged on for a reason no one expected. Kwame claimed he was controlled by a snake inside him. At times, he believed he was God. At others, possessed by demons. Medical records confirmed. He had severe schizophrenia and had been hospitalized for years. Still, the jury ruled sane enough to be held responsible. He was sentenced to death. Then came a shocking twist in 2018. Just before the execution date, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals halted the process. There was evidence suggesting Kwame truly didn't understand why he was being executed. Since then, no one has carried out the sentence. No one has reversed it either. Kwame lives in limbo. Not sane, not insane, not dead, not free. A man trapped in the vaguest definition of justice, competent enough to die. Number 22. Milton Dwayne Gobert, Austin, 2006. Police received an emergency call. The quiet apartment of a woman suddenly filled the air with the heavy scent of blood. When they broke in, they found Tamika McKinney lifeless, with multiple severe injuries. Milton Dwayne Gobert, the the victim's ex-boyfriend, was the last person seen at the scene. Police found his DNA on her hands. When questioned, he stayed silent. No confession, no reaction. He was sentenced to death in 2010. The heartbreaking twist came later in court. His new defense team claimed the original lawyer never properly investigated witnesses or Gobert's mental health history. No independent forensic expert, no psychological testimony. A trial that felt like a rough draft, but the cost was a life. Gobert has sat on death row for 15 years, with no clemency request granted. The man who once stayed silent before the truth is now being drowned out by the silence of justice. Number 23. Richard Vasquez, Houston, 1998. Lucita, a 4-year-old girl, lived with her mother and stepfather, Richard Vasquez. A family that seemed peaceful until one April day brought tragedy. Lucita was taken to the hospital unconscious. Her small body showed signs of severe trauma, a silent accusation of darker days. Despite emergency care, she didn't survive. When asked, Vasquez said, "She fell off the bed." Doctors disagreed. The injuries weren't consistent with a fall. Within hours, Vasquez was arrested. In court, the prosecution claimed Lucita had been abused for days before her death. Witnesses had seen her with bruised eyes, limping. Vasquez denied it, saying he had only disciplined her lightly. The painful contradiction came here. Lucita's mother, who once loved Vasquez, pleaded with the court not to sentence him to death. "He didn't mean to," she said. But justice showed no mercy. Richard Vasquez was sentenced to death in 1999. A small death and a heavy sentence forever erased the image of the stepfather Lucita once called by name. Number 24. Harvey Earvin, Lufkin, Texas. Night of December 17, 1976. Under the glow of the gas station lights, a gunshot tore through the dark. Clarence Bailey collapsed behind the counter, leaving behind a haunting scene under the harsh lights. The cash register was forced open. $300 were gone. 2 young men were arrested the next day. One of them, Harvey Earvin, was just 17 years old. During questioning, he said he just tagged along, claiming he wasn't the one who pulled the trigger, but the jury didn't believe him. 8 months later, Earvin was sentenced to death. He entered death row in October 1977, and has remained there for 47 years. No apology, no retrial, not a single successful appeal. He has survived hundreds of executions. Watched others leave their cells, leaving behind empty beds. But him, he's still there. No date set, no name called. And now, Harvey Earvin holds the record for the longest-standing death sentence in Texas history. Not pardoned, not executed, just forgotten. Number 25. LeJames Norman. 3 names, 3 lives. 1 small house in Edna, Texas. On the night of August 24, 2005, none of them knew it would be their last night counting cash, laughing, and getting ready to leave together. Tiffany, 18, was the first to fall. A single gunshot echoed through the tight space, quick and final. Sam Roberts, 24, didn't even get to turn around before collapsing on the couch. The last one, Celso Lopez, didn't make it to the door. He was pulled back and shot, as if part of a plan that never needed names. The shooter, LeJames Norman, just 19 at the time, no feud, no grudge. Just wanted money to hang out. What shocked everyone more came at trial. Norman didn't appeal, didn't ask for a jury, just nodded and confessed, like he'd walked into the wrong house and was sorry for the mix-up. And that was enough. 3 lives taken in exchange for a death sentence, and a question no one can answer. Did Norman's only real regret come from not getting the money? Number 26. George Edward McFarland, Houston, 1991. A busy roadside shop buzzed with customers during the lunch hour. Kenneth Kwan, the 43-year-old owner, had just finished the books when 2 men burst in. One had a gun. The other gave orders. In 30 seconds, all sound vanished, except for footsteps running away and a body falling behind the counter. Juan never had a chance. The shooter, George McFarland, was arrested days later. Police tracked him through witnesses and security footage. The evidence was undeniable. But the shock wasn't at the crime scene. It happened in court. The trial lasted 17 days, and for most of that time, McFarland's lead attorney was caught sleeping. Prosecutors were outraged, the public stunned, but the court pressed on. There was a backup lawyer who was awake, said the legal system coldly. McFarland was sentenced to death. Years later, new lawyers appealed. How can a trial be fair when your defender is asleep? But the court refused to reopen the case. McFarland didn't just die because of a bullet, he died in a courtroom, where justice nodded off. Number 27, Pablo Melendez Jr., Tarrant County, Texas, early September night, 1994. Gunshots rang out in a quiet neighborhood. By the time neighbors stepped outside, all they saw was a shadow fading into the dark. On the sidewalk, Michael Sanders, 26 years old, lay motionless, chest wounded, wallet gone. It took days for police to find a suspect, Pablo Melendez Jr., just 16 at the time. Accused of pulling a gun for money and firing during an argument. No apology, no sign of remorse. The trial ended quickly. In 1996, he was sentenced to death. Pablo entered death row before he was old enough to drink, but old enough to be sentenced to die. Behind the verdict stood a mother who never accepted it. Michael's mother didn't believe justice was truly served. She searched out witnesses, rechecked statements, but no one listened. No one wanted to reopen the case. The truth, if it ever existed, may have been sealed forever with the verdict. And Pablo, terrifying or not, was still just a teenager when he walked through the gates of death row. A child, treated as though he had been grown for a long time. Number 28, Juan Segundo, Fort Worth, Texas. The year 1986. Vanessa Villa, 11 years old, had just walked into her home, hugging her teddy bear. Her mother stepped out for just a few minutes. When she returned, she screamed. Vanessa was found lifeless in the bathroom, a bra strap wrapped around her neck. The scene showed signs of a deeply disturbing attack. No suspects. The case faded into silence. Until 2005, when DNA identified the killer, Juan Segundo, a man with a prior conviction for sexual assault. Worse, he was linked to 3 other rape and murder cases from 1994. He was sentenced to death in 2006. Execution was scheduled for 2018, then postponed. The twisted turn came from the law itself. In 2022, the court confirmed Segundo had a congenital intellectual disability. He could not be executed. His sentence was reduced to life in prison. A man who took the lives of at least 4 women, now allowed to live. The law protects those who don't understand their actions, but the victims? They understood the pain of death all too well. In that bathroom, the memories remain colder than water, and hearts have yet to heal. Number 29. Larry Dean Hatton, Corpus Christi, 1995. A hot, humid night. A cartoon still played in a small apartment in the southern part of the city, until it was drowned out by gunfire. Larry Dean Hatton emerged from the dark holding a smoking gun, mumbling hateful words no one could comprehend. The man he was aiming for was already dead, but the second bullet, fired at no one, pierced a thin wall and struck a 5-year-old boy sitting in front of the TV. The boy was struck while sitting in front of the TV. The screen kept flashing until his mother rushed in, crying out in horror. Hatton was arrested afterward. He was sentenced to death. But starting in 1997, his appeal documents were mailed to the wrong address. It wasn't until 2014, nearly 20 years later, that someone accidentally rediscovered the file. Now, almost 30 years have passed, and no execution date has been set. In that apartment long ago, the television has stayed off ever since. The mother has never turned it back on,